Good morning, everyone. We're going to give everyone a few more minutes to join us and look forward to the session soon thereafter. Actually, we'll probably get started with housekeeping items. First of all, my name is Ezra Beeman. I'm Managing Director of Energea. It's great to be delivering this webinar from our Sydney office. Thank you for joining us today and making time. I know you're very busy. And by way of background, and I guess scene setting for this particular session, I'm the former pricing strategy manager for Ausgrid, used to be Energy Australia, also the managing director of Empower Energy, which specializes in power conversion technologies, i.e. hybrid solar batteries, and is using some patented optimization algorithms that I developed thanks to Commercialization Australia. And so I think I have a pretty unique insight into the difference between efficient pricing prior to some of the recent developments in behind the meter resources and what the future might hold. In terms of housekeeping items, I'm being helped today by Sarah. She's going to be managing questions and any other sort of organizational and coordination processes around this webinar. Please add your questions to the chat at any time. Sarah will help make sure those get presented to me at the end of the session. There's also a survey question, which I think you can vote on at any time, and that really helps guide what the next webinar is going to be. This is our last webinar for 2023, but we will have the next one sometime later in January. It is the current plan. I think that's it for us. Hopefully, it's given some time for people to join us, but we're going to get stuck into it now. Okay, so today's topic is on maximizing efficient customer energy resource adoption. And we're going to start with Economics 101. Apologize for that in advance. I'm sure many of you have effectively avoided economics for most of your lifetime, but hopefully this will all be delivered in about 5 minutes and relate directly to the topic, and you'll be able to persevere. After that, for those that are still awake, we'll be working on the national electricity rules with respect to tariff design and pricing. I think it's really important to have both the economics and the regulations in front of us when we then talk about what does best practice rate design, tariff design, and incentive design look like. And then we're going to turn to some case studies about how we have implemented that to hopefully give you a sense of how you can actually take that knowledge forward and implement it into your everyday work. Regardless of whether you are a pricing manager or someone that regulates pricing managers or a policymaker or even in industry yourself, hopefully this will be something that is useful for all of these perspectives. Okay. So, Economics 101, let's talk about price elasticity of demand, what that means and why it matters, productive efficiency, allocative efficiency, and then Ramsey pricing. So, why are we even having this discussion? In part, it's because of the unique attributes of electricity that have governed the way it's been priced for about 150 years. Electricity has long been known as a price inelastic good, and that's because there's been no good way to store it primarily, and there's no real good substitutes, particularly in the short term. And that means your approach to pricing can vary quite significantly from what we would call efficient pricing, because there really just wasn't any choice. And so really the regulators had to focus on, over the long run, in general, are costs equal to revenues at a class level? And that's really how the rules have been set up to date. Now, because of new technology, this is all changing and changing rather dramatically. We've gone from almost no responsiveness and it being hard to having more than 100% of your usage being able to be controlled by two cars with vehicle to grid. That's maybe 200 kilowatt hours for every single family dwelling. As well as the ability to manage water heating and a few other things. Now we have AI, and that's going to solve everything. But in all sort of seriousness, it takes the automation It takes the automation as being hard and makes it much easier to respond. So now, given this sort of a reality, if we do not offer cost-reflective, and I'll explain why that matters, pricing and incentives, we are going to, at best, underutilize customer energy resources, and at worst, build two infrastructures or have them behave in a way that actually drives costs. For example, everybody responding to the change in the time of use price that's off peak, creating a new peak. So, and as I say here, price elasticity is a really important concept in pricing theory, and we'll talk about Ramsey pricing at the end and how it factors in. So, there are really three different kinds of efficiency in economics, at least at the first order efficiency. They are productive efficiency, allocative efficiency, and dynamic efficiency. So productive efficiency is really achieving a state whereby the combination of input factors is the least cost for your output. Your factors of production are least cost for the given output. And so in the case of the energy system or the electricity system, we've just put in here that it might be bulk resources, behind the meter resources. You could look at this as transmission versus generation. Really, the portfolio is much more complex than that, but this is just laid out this way to prove a point. Now, ultimately, we want the economy, the community, to find the least cost combination of inputs to generate electricity, and that's consistent with the national electricity objective, being that costs are least costs given reliability, safety, and a few other parameters, and the environment now. So one of the key things to get productive efficiency correct is to actually have the costs and the prices be accurate. If you don't have accurate costs or price signals, then you're not gonna really be able to do productive efficiency correctly. So let's talk about allocative efficiency. So allocative efficiency is generally when marginal costs are equal to marginal revenue. Now that occurs naturally in a purely competitive market, and in regulated markets, it's what the regulator ultimately tries to achieve, although there's some boundaries around avoidable cost and standalone costs. But the reason you do it is that if prices marginal revenue does not equal marginal cost, and marginal revenue is related to pricing in that the price determines what the marginal revenue is. And so you can say marginal pricing is to marginal cost, and it equates via the revenue outcome. So if pricing and marginal revenue is not equal to marginal cost, it's either too high or too low, you're either going to overconsume or underconsume, and that creates what's called deadweight loss, which is just bad. And so the greater the extent that marginal revenue equals marginal cost, the more efficient the outcome is going to be in the economy. And traditionally, it hasn't really worked because there's been no substitutes. Yes, you have over and under consumption, but it hasn't been nearly to the same degree that we're facing with electric vehicles and behind the meter storage in particular. So here's an example of why you want marginal revenue to equal marginal cost. If you've got the customer cost of supply on the left-hand side here, and you take rooftop solar PV and it reduces the annual bill this much, but it only reduces the whole system's of cost to serve by this much, there's a cross subsidy. And so what that does is people tend to overconsume rooftop PV and other people have to pay for it. So this is just a worked example of why you want marginal cost equal to marginal revenue. If these were equal, you would reduce the amount of revenue impact, you'd reduce the investment incentive, but you would also have marginal revenue for the investment equal to marginal cost, and you would have no subsidy. So while you need to have marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, particularly during times of the peak period of peak demand, because more demand tends to require more supply, you often have to recover costs outside of that relationship because of the boom-bust nature, not so much boom-bust, but capital-intensive nature of the electricity system, such that you pay a lot of money for like transmission assets or generation assets, but they're there and they've got a very small, a relatively low marginal cost to operate. And so you get into a situation where if you just use the long run marginal cost, you wouldn't recover all of the costs that you've already made. And generally the regulatory pact is to allow for recovery of all costs as long as they were prudently incurred and efficiently incurred. And so you have what's left over as residual costs that have to be recovered some way. Now, how they're recovered and the efficient way of recovering them is really normally credited to Frank Ramsey. He actually did his work in tax policy, but it's been applied to electricity. And it basically says that you need to recover those costs in the least distortionary way, and that's primarily to allocate them to demand that is less price inelastic. And as an example, if you haven't bought solar PV in your house or a battery or an electric vehicle, you're really elastic at that point, and your decisions, just assuming it doesn't get banned, are going to be driven by cost. And so, we for another time to think through exactly who's inelastic, because you have to be careful to not just assign them to folks that live in rented apartments that can't do anything, and that's definitely a social issue that needs to be factored in. Okay, so let's talk then about what is required under the Australian National Electricity Rules when you are designing tariffs. So I'm not going to walk you through all this in detail, but there are called out here a number of key passages, and they generally respond to, or they generally call out what's required in the design. And in summary, things like efficiency has to be at the class level. It doesn't actually have to be during the peak period. It's not really clear exactly what you have to do. It's based on having regard to, you can really get a combine harvester through that sort of terminology. Definition of long run marginal cost is pretty clear, as is the need for determining the times of greatest utilization. Apologies for the Z, which is the peak period, but they don't give more guidance than that. And long run is the period over which all costs are variable. We'll get to that in a second because it's pretty important. It says that there's a need to minimize distortions to efficient usage, i.e. during the peak period. But they have there's a exception here that they may vary from principles where it's not voluntary. So if you had an optional tariff, then that would deal with that, or where it's not comprehensive. Now, I can barely read my own electricity bill because it's that complex, and so there's a whole question there. But I tell you what, AI and automation and coding basically will take whatever is out there and will be able to comprehend it. So I think in the brave new world of the future, we really need to wonder how this clause actually gets applied, particularly for the voluntary tariffs, which may be more like prices to devices. But we need those to be there. Otherwise, the devices are going to be not necessarily making efficient decisions. Finally, there's how do you classify customers? It talks about economically efficient. That can be a bit vague, but cost to serve and price sensitivity are probably not a bad way to do the classification. So finally, one thing I just want to bring to everybody's attention is there's already a precedent in the National Electricity Rules for providing benefits back to distributed energy. This was developed in the case of embedded generation, so it could actually be quite a large generator, but it's connected at the sub-transmission system, so not subject to transmission cost recovery. But it provides a framework for rebating that back, which will allow that particular type of asset to either bid lower because it's getting this other revenue stream, or encourage more investment closer to what the efficient level is. All right, let's talk about best practice tariff design and really the sort of state of the art here. We'll talk about congestion, which is the time that's most likely to drive peak demand, long run marginal cost, the rate design options, and incentive design, efficient incentive design. So apologies for this. It's really hard. It's really small, really hard to see. Let me just tell you what you're looking at here. We've got by month, we've got by hour, by half hour. This is weekdays, this is weekends, and this is a raw view of the percentage of substations that are in the top 5% of consumption, 5 or 10%, right? So they're arguably in the peak period of maximum congestion. And anything that is less than anything that's, I think yellow is 25 to 40%, and then red is greater than 50%. And really, determining when a peak period is difficult for a distribution system because you've got all of these assets and they're not all going to be peaking at the same time, which we can see here. But if you look at in this case as in Victoria, and by law, they all have to have the same period, at least for one tariff, you can see that the actual peak timing of these is not aligned even with the few years that we've chosen to look at here. A lot of the substations are peaking well outside of that. So a couple of things. In best practice, you need to normalize this for the weather of that particular year. Once you do that, it clears up a number of overloads. You get a much tighter sort of distribution of when peaking's likely to occur on, say, a P50 or the one. Actually, this is 1 in 10 years. So that's a really important step. And then the final one is you can't just look at backwards sort of peak. You need to think about how this is going to look over the period ahead. And when you do that, it even gets a little bit smaller still. So if you were to apply pure theory, just no other considerations, the peak period would actually be a much shorter time span. Now, that's important for a couple of reasons. One is you don't actually have to serve this use case most of the time. You could be focusing on wholesale market use cases, or you could be focusing on something else. The other issue is you have to collect the same amount of revenue for an additional increment of supply, but you're going to collect it over a much smaller period, and therefore it's going to be a lot higher. So it dramatically changes what the actual pricing and timing of that pricing is that would apply. Now, what's actually being done at the moment? So we did a little bit of a survey. We looked at how these peak periods were being assessed, how many years were considered, what were the customer classes considered, what was the actual definition, and whether it was weather normalized or based on a forecast. And what we found is almost no one's doing this at the moment, and there's no guidance in the rules, so it's somewhat understandable. But as we really hone in on these AIs that have control over what's already the largest asset. I mean, if they were in control of rooftop solar PV, it's already the largest asset in the NEM. Behind the meter storage is going to be a formidable asset. And so it's pretty important that we get the signaling to them done right. That might be a real-time signal, or it just might be a more efficient static signal. Okay, let's talk about long-run marginal cost. So we talked about when that cost has to be recovered and the right signaling there, but what actually should be in that? What we're showing here is current LRMCs, and again, I hate to pick on Victoria here, but they just happen to have a lot of the data available. So that's the only reason they're being shown here, not other states. The same issues apply in virtually all of the states. So what we did here is we used our own long-run marginal cost calculator fed with regulatory information notice data, or RIN data. And we looked at, well, what would be the difference in dollars per incremental kVA if we actually included all costs, being variable. And that's consistent with the rule definition. And I think it's also consistent with good economic theory. And so we found that the long-run marginal costs, or if we did that, if we applied all of the costs, the OGX and the RepX, I don't think we've included Connex here, so it doesn't include the customer stuff. You see that the prices would actually be twice as high as they are now, at least for these networks. And you can see here on the right, this comes from a particular regulatory proposal. It shows how the distribution business systematically looked at all of their assets and said, oh, well, a portion of this goes to OGX, but most of it doesn't, right? In this case, I don't think they're applying the rule of the long run being the period over which all costs are variable. And I know there's been guidance and feedback from the regulator that says that you should really only look in the next little while. But we're raising here that we don't think that that's consistent necessarily with the rules in our view, or with good economic practice. And it's going to matter a lot more moving forward. Let's put it that way. Right, so how is long-run marginal cost being calculated? And again, we find a huge amount of variation as to how much actual proposed expenditures included. It ranges from 0 to 142%. What is the actual ratio of OPEX to CAPEX? And these all have really big impacts on what LRMC is calculated to be. When is the start year? So I'm not arguing here that it should all be monolithic, because there are good reasons to vary. But I do believe that the current state is a reflection of the rules, and that the rules were a bit tighter on what's needed for economic outcomes and least cost outcomes, that we probably would see a little bit more alignment and consistency in the development of long-run marginal costs and their impact on final prices. So the other thing I want to pull out is long-run marginal cost for load, especially when it's taking it from a utility scale resource, uses the LV, HV, subtransmission, and transmission, and then of course the generation. However, if you're actually getting resources from your neighbor that has too much, and we can have a discussion about this, but generally speaking, you're using a conductor between you and they, unless there's backfeed. And then the backfeed is like if you're getting it from a medium voltage source somewhere else, that's it. That does require the medium or high voltage network. But it's fundamentally different, the way that the power system works on a decentralized basis, and that's not currently built into the rules. The closest thing we have is the export pricing rule change, where a long-run marginal cost of export pricing is now being developed. However, that's charging decentralized energy for the use of the network, as opposed to recognizing that it's a different system pathway, and that, like avoided TUOS, there's probably a benefit that's not being credited at the moment. So with long-run marginal cost and the timing of the peak in hand, let's talk about what does a rates or a pricing manager have to work with. So we've got the peak components, and that can be done through an average, a max, some kind of hybrid. It can use kVA, kilowatts, kilowatt hours, could be on an annual basis, et cetera. And these all can be done in a cost-reflective way, but we just don't know which is the most appropriate to get the most economic outcomes. And we'll talk about how we achieve that using a simulator in the next section. For the residual recovery we talked about, you've also got mostly the same options here. And again, we don't know which is necessarily going to deliver the best outcomes that reflect Ramsey pricing as well as the other allocative efficiency principles. Finally, in not all markets is it possible, and this is mostly what I learned in the US jurisdictions, where it's very difficult to introduce new rate designs, new tariff designs, a lot of pushback. And so a lot of the utilities are keeping their current designs for people that don't have DER and are not touching anything the same. And what they're doing is they're offering incentives, rebates, maybe monthly payments for access to or control of these behind the meter assets. And the way to do that properly is to really meet the gap of what that new resource is going to do to the bill. So here we have the customer savings in the pink and gray, and then we compare that to the actual change in the utility cost structure, right? Just as we showed earlier. And so if you're trying to do an incentive here for LADW, for the utility savings versus the the customer savings versus the utility savings, then you have to provide an incentive that meets this gap. For EVs, the gap's a bit smaller. For storage, like they don't have time of use pricing, so there was no benefit. And here with NEM Solar, it's actually the other way around, and really only cost-reflective tariffs are gonna deal with that. But this right here is how efficient incentives need to be designed, and to do that, you really have to understand what your current impacts on cost of service, as well as what the bill impacts are going to be. So let's talk about how we've tackled this for clients. So this is actually quite an old case study, quite an old project. A lot of the more recent work is confidential. And so what we find here is this was done back in 2016 or 17, where rooftop solar and behind the meter storage were significantly higher cost. And yet some of these rate designs are going to encourage a significant investment in those resources compared to others. So just bear that in mind. Really, we hope to, in a future session, rerun these analyses with latest and greatest pricing. And I think I know you're going to see a very different outcome to what we're showing you today. But the methodology here will be the same. So what we've got is a number of different ways of recover the peak mechanism. Think about that organogram I showed you earlier, and a number of ways to recover the residual, and then a whole bunch of different combinations thereof as prices. And going into this, we have no way of knowing which of these are going to be to deliver a more efficient outcome, i.e. least cost for the whole community. So what do we mean by community costs? if you take the retail, the generation costs, the network costs, and then behind the meter costs, say distributed generation, but it's any resource behind the meter, that's the total community cost. So you can't just say, oh, it's lowering the centralized system, but we're paying more for behind the meter. It's taking all of that into account. And what we found was, and this is a sub-selection thereof, but you can see when they all started here at about 18% adoption, some of the incentives drove up to 59%. Some didn't really stop it in its tracks. And so this, I think, just demonstrates the power of the price signal in terms of delivering a different commercial outcome to customers. I know not all customers behave rationally, but generally over time, most of the people, most of the time, are utility maximizing, i.e., they do what's going to put the most dollars in their pocket. Likewise, you look down here, we have, this is the average uptake per customer. Keep in mind that these are much higher cost resources. And then here, we're showing the cumulative impact. And again, under the business as usual tariffs, inclining block tariffs, seasonal time of use energy, you had among the highest levels of adoption only of PV. There was changes in the mix here, with some of them almost stopping the mix entirely. So I think of these slides, the thing I'll jump to is right here. This is where we looked at the millions in dollars present value of community costs. Now you want to have those minimized, and then there's a cross subsidy, and that's important too, and it tends to relate to the Ramsey pricing applicability. And what we're basically showing is those that stopped the adoption of higher cost resources in their track had the lowest cost, and the ones that encouraged more had higher community costs. Now today, this is going to look very different because of the dramatic change in solar PV costs and behind the meter storage. But again, the method is what matters. All right, so I see we're almost on time for the core presentation. If you are able to stay a few minutes after for questions, that'd be great. But here the key takeaways are rates and incentives are the primary driver for CER adoption, and then how it actually operates. And virtually all rates and incentives do not yet reflect key economic principles, at least to the degree that I'd like to see, which is resulting in efficient adoption and operation. Key reforms we'd suggest include unbundling, locational accurate long-run marginal cost and period calculation, and fair residual cost allocation. If we get that right, we should deliver a significantly higher levels of the right kind of CER, consumer energy resources in the right places and at the right times and in the right mix. And that if you doing the reforms doesn't necessarily mean, it shouldn't mean that utilities are not going to recover their efficient costs, nor that it's going to disadvantage particular groups, but that has to be done with care. Finally, key recommendations. We probably do need to focus on this section of the rules. I mean, it's about 10 years old. There have been some updates, but I believe based on this initial review that significant gains could be had through a rule change. Real-time pricing is nice to have, but it's not necessarily what you need. And I do acknowledge the work of Allsgrid with their pricing trial of real-time pricing, Edith. I wish there was more information there because I haven't really been able to understand how it's actually working. And I'll leave you with a final thought, which is, you've got a couple of relationships here, whether it's E equals MC squared or the second law of thermodynamics. Most people don't argue with these laws, and they have a really sound body of evidence against underpinning them. But I know almost no one, when I talk about marginal revenue equals marginal cost, I take it with any kind of level of seriousness of these other two. And that's probably reasonable, but I think the importance of the economic fundamental principles are going to be increasingly important in this space. All right, thank you. I think now we are into Q&A. So let me open up. All right, as an individual customer, I may be able to optimize battery charging given current tariffs. However, at some point, many others may adopt similar behavior, at which point would not the optimized charging pattern may change or gain diminish over time. Absolutely. So I think there's something called the fallacy of composition, which is if any one person does it, it's okay, but if everybody does it, it'll change everything. So yeah, this is one of the issues with time of use pricing, especially when everybody responds all at once, that is probably going to collapse under that weight once all the robots get a hold of the resources and drive new peak periods in the off-peak. So we need new solutions for dealing with that. And I would expect pricing and price signals to change over time. When you say a rule change is probably needed to unbundle, what exactly would you unbundle? So what I would exactly unbundle or look at unbundling is charging for the use of the medium voltage and high voltage and subtransmission when distributed energy is actually being used on the low voltage. And we need to work through what that means, but we don't charge transmission customers for lower voltage parts of the network because they're not, in theory, not really using them. The electrons go from the power station on the transmission grid to them on the transmission grid. But when we have folks that are looking to use decentralized energy, we're charging them for everything. They're all the medium, the high voltage, the subtransmission, and the transmission. Okay. Should there be a charge for availability of transmission when not enough DER? I mean, this is like a backup situation, and in interruptible tariffs or backup, you're really paying for that backup. Now, one of the key questions is could folks be on a tariff that they don't actually have to pay for any of this, because during the peak period, during any outages, they will actually kick on their own resources and not use any of the network. I think those that are relying on that transmission system and want it there and available to them, then they need to pay for that capacity. I think that's a cost causation and user pays concept. Soon customers will have a choice, V to X, and potentially disconnect from the network. How do we structure tariffs to keep them connected? I think that's a really, really important question, particularly for areas of the network where you've got a lot of single-family dwellings, a lot of roof space, a lot of energy coming in, but also in transport. Like there'll be some issues of competition about where you actually recharge, but mostly it's the issue of being able to store energy and having enough energy because you're a resident. This doesn't work for larger customers, C&I, et cetera, unless they've got large solar arrays near them. And so we looked at this with the ENA's National Network Transformation Roadmap, and we actually looked at how do we stop people from disconnecting. And some of the answer there was in these flexible rate designs where you basically didn't charge people. It was more cost reflective, and it looked almost like a whole of home controlled load tariff, where the premise could be taken offline, freeing up that capacity for others, and also offering a discount. The other thing is if those that have excess amounts of DER are able to trade it and there's value in there, that's changing the rate design so that you're recovering not just on one-way flows but both ways. These are all different things that have to be looked at. But this is a real issue that's coming at us at light speed. And people are going to have to ask themselves, especially if they're like me and PG&E's raising rates in California by like 50% over the next 5 years. It's just phenomenal, while rooftop solar and EVs and all the rest of it is going in the other direction fast. Given tariffs are hard to change, is the solution to have shadow prices for CER? I don't know that you have to have shadow prices. I think you can have optional prices, right? And so I agree that let's leave folks that are not changing what they're doing alone, or make sure at a class level that they're efficient. But for those folks that have the AI and the resources that are under control, the option to be on this other tariff so that they can respond in an efficient way and get paid efficient benefits in return. Yeah, I mean, the landlord-tenant thing, this is not new for customer energy resources at all. I think, and I have not seen a good way to sort of deal with that. Community resources might be a way we can offer virtualization. I mean, you've got different approaches to splitting shared resources on a building. Yeah, I think it would take almost another session to really nut through that particular issue. And we can start where it's easier, which is owner-occupied single-family dwellings, and move on from there. Also, beside landlord, tenant, household members, or employees are not bill payers. Yeah, I mean, I think the issue is who's investing in Durham. I mean, you can also have a situation like Rocky Mountain Power in the U.S. where they're going to give everybody a Tesla Powerwall to deal with their reliability issues, and then you're basically renting the wall. And so, just who owns it, who operates it, and who benefits from it has to be worked through. But right now, I'm just saying that the prices are not going to get the right investment or operating outcomes unless it's you could say the networks, but then are they going to optimize for generation? Thoughts on end use specific tariffs? So I think if you have this is a good question, and it's long been a question in pricing. I think you need to have appliance specific incentives because you're trying to deal with the difference in how each appliance impacts, or each of the other kinds of customer energy resources impacts on the bill and what the gap is relative to the reduction in utility costs. When it comes to an actual cost reflective rate design, that's reflective of the system of the actual cost to serve, and that doesn't vary by end use. And so if you have a real cost reflective tariff, it doesn't need to vary by who's actually using it. There are some exceptions to that, but that's a detail. Well, I should have expected this question. What are your thoughts on moving network tariffs away from peak demand and more like property tax value? And I guess one of the initial thought is we're moving from cost causation to ability to pay, assuming you can get what everybody's earnings are correct. I mean, I think you need to have marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, regardless of how much money you make. If you don't have it, you have all the problems that I just tried to explain. How you recover the residual costs, though, I think that's where economic theory and social objectives can work more better together, and that's probably part of the answer there. Electrification. Everything that we've looked at means electrification are going to change the peaks. Probably a lot, depending on how cold it is, right? In warm places, electrification probably not going to change the peak a whole lot. It might get later, but that's because solar's eating out the day. Everybody gets home, has their car plugged in. So EVs are driving a later peak in warmer climates, and heating could be driving a lot more peak in the early morning period. So yes, I mean, rates are going to have to change. They're going to have to change significantly just to keep track with this. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure presenting this information to you. If you have any follow-up questions, please send them through. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you all back in January, and have a great rest of your year. Thank you very much.